Okay, so last time we kind of talked about Microsoft and their relationship with Java, tried to take it. That didn't work out, so they came out with another language called C Sharp, which kind of um, duplicated some things from Java, but then maybe fixed some other things that Java had some weaknesses with. So we'll call C Sharp, I think it's fair to say it's an improvement, with the downside that it's a Microsoft only language. We'll say that's a downside, but I think we kind of pointed out last time that Microsoft is pretty prevalent, specifically in the desktop world. So is that really a downside, or is that just an Apple user perception? So we talked about kind of how .NET handles their thing, and where it's pretty much identical to the Java model with the exception of this idea of a just-in-time compiler. And .NET's claim, which was, I guess, funny at the time, but I don't even know why they went out of their way to say it was platform independent, but they claimed it was platform independent on any platform that supports the .NET component architecture, which is just Windows. So kind of a little funny thing there. It seems like it would just been more appropriate to not say it's platform independent and say, hey, we're Microsoft, this is our new language, come write Microsoft stuff with it. So I mentioned kind of from a native language perspective, here's our big three: Java, C Sharp, and Objective-C. The tool we're going to end up using in here, even though we're not going to work with Java directly until near the end of the semester, is actually built on top of Java. So it's also the first semester we've used this tool, so it'll be interesting to see whether it crashes and burns or ends up being a good thing. But I guess whatever. So so we talked about the evolution of Objective-C. Really kind of went through this fairly quickly. Kind of said just treat it like it's C++ with a little bit of different syntax. Fair enough. Kind of glossing over the Apple side of things. We talked some about the kind of the backstory of how Apple got to be who they are today, so we can really understand our modern platforms for computing. So Apple, they fired Steve Jobs, almost failed as a company, brought Steve Jobs back, but not directly. They purchased the company that Steve Jobs had built outside of Apple called Next. Steve Jobs comes back as the interim CEO of Apple, which was failing as a company, I'm sure, behind the scenes, that had much to do with the idea that he was willing to pay Apple's payroll and stuff out of his own pocket, so I'm sure there was an agreement there. But in any case, later they started calling him the iCEO because of all these I things that we all attribute to him, but I'm sure there was a pretty big team of smart people behind him that helped make these things realities. Whether the spark came out of his head or came out of somebody else's head, and he added the shine or whatever. He was considered to be the captain driving the ship, I suppose. But certainly when we look at the history of Apple, these are the things that come to mind, much more so than the early days of Apple, the Apple IIe running DOS, or even the early Macintosh computers. The Macintosh Lisa was the computer that a lot of the movies point out was, named after his daughter, who he said wasn't his daughter, and because he had a daughter with a woman who happened to be named Lisa, and for a while he said it wasn't his daughter, and it just so happens the computer was named Lisa, and then he tried to say the acronym stood for something else, and later on he said it stood for her or whatever. But those are the things that make the movies. That's what gets into the movies. But realistically, when we think about Apple, we're mostly thinking about the company that came up with the iPod, the iMac, the iPhone, the iPad, these things, all those devices. Okay? And then we usually have this idea of proprietariness, and then maybe the most overarching idea that the modern I guess that modern people would look at Apple as being, they think it's a premium product, at least from a price perspective, right? Typically Apple's considered to be expensive. The argument that I typically make to technology majors, I may or may not have mentioned it in here, when a student comes up and asks, well, I'm going to get a new laptop, what should I get? I almost always suggest a Mac, not because they're better, but it's 2 machines for the price of 1.7. One computer can run both Windows and the Mac operating system, like legitimately, as opposed to getting a PC and trying to run the Mac side on a Hackintosh install, which is going to be, let's say, iffy at best. So a Macintosh computer allows a technologist to effectively have all the software technology they might need for their 4 years of school, and also when they get out of school, all on one computer. So when you really look at it that way, you're getting a discount. So the price of 1.7 computers, but you get 2. All right. But, if you're a grandpa who's just going to check his email, probably an Apple computer is not necessarily a requirement. That would be, along the same lines when people buy Cadillacs or, maybe to a bigger degree, Ferraris or something, an expensive car that's going to get you to work just as much as the cheapo one that's reliable. Right? They're going to both get you to work, but we buy nicer cars, and because maybe you want a nicer car, and there's a status symbol or something with it. So I think there's an aspect of that to Apple. At the end of the day, what's inside these machines is the same as what's inside of a PC. Same processor, same RAM. In fact, actually, it's maybe worse on Apple's side now. More and more often, Apple is making their computers. I mean, historically, Apple would say we would void our warranty if we tried to upgrade like the memory or something like that in our computer. Well, now Apple is soldering the RAM and the hard drive onto the motherboard, so you can't even upgrade it. I have a friend of mine who, spent $2,500 or something on a 15-inch MacBook Pro, pretty similar to this machine, and it came with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and he'd like to get 16. Well, I happened to order mine with 16 in it, so I'm good for a while. This is a 2012. So it's an older machine, but it has plenty of resources, so I'm relatively happy, except maybe battery life is starting to wear out. But he can't upgrade his Mac to 16 gigabytes because the memory is soldered on. And I don't even think Apple will do the upgrade. I don't think you could take it into an Apple store and say, I want more RAM. I think they just say, okay, buy a new computer, which seems reasonable. And you get more money going to Apple. Pretty good position for them. But in any case, all these machines have the same crap in them. Why is it then, if a Mac is Intel based and uses the same memory and uses the same hard drives and all that stuff, why is it that a Mac can run Windows, but a Windows machine can't run the Macintosh operating system? So I just made this argument that it's 2 machines for the price of 1.7. Well, why can't we look at a higher end Hewlett-Packard laptop and say it's 2 machines for the price of 1.1 or 1.2? Why can't you run the Macintosh OS on a Windows machine? What's preventing you from doing it? Go ahead. Okay. Well, so that might be an argument for why you can't legally run it on a Windows machine. But I'm sure none of you in here have ever done anything in the ethical gray area, downloading music that maybe you didn't pay for, or movies, things like that. Bottom line is, do you think that would really stop people? If Apple just said, we don't want you installing our operating system on a Windows machine, do you think you would still find plenty of machines that had the Macintosh operating system on it? Yeah, I think so. Truly just trying before they're going to buy, I'm sure. All right, so now there's a physical problem with it. Go ahead.
Is it because it's written in C#, which is only compatible with Microsoft stuff?
No, I mean, based on what we've been talking about recently, that's not a bad approach to it. The Macintosh operating system and Windows are actually probably both written. The majority of them are written in C and C++. The stuff that's Objective-C is really a layer that lays on top of the Mac OS. And most of that's because Apple's OS is based on the next operating system, which is based on OpenBSD Unix. So, I mean, don't give Apple too much credit. They just took an operating system that worked really, really well, put a nice front end on it, and said, this is the new Mac OS. And then they probably broke a few things in there, so they made it a little bit worse than it used to be from a Unix operating system perspective. Go ahead.
Is
it a preventing thing from when they designed different hardware that was only able to run their stuff,
Mhm.
so other people couldn't?
Yeah, so even at the hardware level, Macs and PCs have disagreed for a while. Um, let's roll back even just a few years. On the Apple side of things, the prevalent cool devices were FireWire-based devices. So if you were a person who did a lot of graphic work or multimedia videos type stuff, the cool external hard drive to get would be a FireWire based hard drive. If you were, because you're probably using a Mac anyways for their software, let's say, as opposed to USB for everybody else. And now, if you look at machines today, USB's kind of won that war, right? Now the reality is that just kind of slightly off topic, but a little bit on topic. Why is it that FireWire hard drives were preferred? I mean, first of all, the hard drive that was inside of that external drive are identical. We're just talking about the interface with it. So the interface from the computer to that hard drive was FireWire based as opposed to USB based. Why was FireWire the preferred technology for doing multimedia like video editing and stuff like that as opposed to USB? And then we look at it today and say USB 1. Go ahead.
Didn't have a faster transfer speed?
No, USB 2 is substantially faster than FireWire. Now, at some point in there, the answer to your question was probably yes. So I think FireWire 1 was faster than USB 1, which was 11 megabit per second shared. But then USB 2 came out, which was 400 megabit per second compared to like 200 megabit per second. In the end, USB was considered to be, I'm going to do the air quote thing, we'll say faster. So there's actually something else that your average, well, not your average, I mean, obviously video editing and stuff like that is a specialized skill, right? So there's something else that those folks are really looking for. It's not just pure speed. Anybody in here do any video editing stuff, multimedia stuff, things like that? Okay. So when you're doing that kind of stuff, do you care more? I mean, rendering a video takes time, right? Okay. So are you willing to spend an extra 20 minutes having a video render as long as in the end it's accurate versus 20 minutes faster and have some jumpy frames and stuff? You kind of want it to look good, right? And if it costs you an extra 20 minutes, you'd rather have that than it turn out to be that you wasted the time rendering it. So this actually goes way, way, way back to the technologies that came before USB and FireWire. So this goes back to serial versus parallel. So if you had a modem years ago, these operated off the serial port on your computer. If you had a printer, these operated off the parallel port in your computer. Well, what's the difference between serial technology and parallel technology? Parallel sends stuff in 8-bit bursts. Serial sends stuff 1 bit after another. Okay, so fast forwarding it to FireWire versus USB, we would say, he mentioned something about speed with USB. When USB talks about speed, they talk about a maximum throughput. USB drives would be considered to be bursty. So sometimes they're going very, very, very fast. Sometimes they start slowing down because you have this abundance of data all kind of smashing into each other in the cable, right? Because you're sending chunks of data, bursts of data at once. Whereas FireWire was 1 bit after another. So a much smoother interstate, even though everybody was kind of going the same speed on the interstate with FireWire, as opposed to USB, where you had some conservative drivers and then a couple of lunatics zipping all over the place. So FireWire was considered superior for video multimedia stuff if you were using an external drive, mainly because you would get a more accurate final thing because there was less stuff that could go wrong, even at the cost of it being a little bit slower. Okay. Now, the reality is most people are going to have a computer that has a big hard drive in it that you're accessing it through serial ATA, which is actually interesting because serial ATA is SATA drives. It's a serial technology more like FireWire, where before serial ATA we had IDE-based hard drives, and you messed with some of this stuff in 175, I think, right? You built a computer and crap like that with some of these wires. Sleeping during that class? But in any case, it's interesting how it's been flip-flopped. So in the early days of let's say, our hard drives, the competing technologies were SCSI connections versus IDE connections. SCSI was serial, IDE was parallel. Well, IDE won that war. So parallel for IDE, parallel for USB. Well, now our modern hard drives are serial based, serial ATA. So it's 1 bit at a time. Let's say more consistent. That's won the hard drive war. Yet USB, which is parallel, has won the external war or something like that. All right. So having said that, just kind of an interesting backstory, and where we were going to with this is Apple designs. So at the hardware level, PCs and Macs have disagreed with each other for a long time. So where I was going with the USB versus Firewire thing is even up to just a couple of years ago, a Mac can boot off a Firewire drive, but could not boot off a USB drive. A PC could boot off a USB drive, but could not boot off a Firewire drive. The software level, they wouldn't allow it to boot off those two different technologies, just I don't know, almost just out of spite. It seemed like, okay? So now both of them can boot off USB drives, and I think Apple's probably can still boot off Firewire, just nobody uses them. So it's more of that at this point. But so the punchline here for why you can't run the Mac OS conveniently on a PC is really twofold. The first part of it is we have this thing called a BIOS in our computer. Okay, so this is a miniature operating system that lives on a little chip. All right, and this kind of gets the ball rolling. When you hit the power button on your computer, that guy does what's necessary to grab the operating system that's living on your disk, Windows or the Mac OS, and load it into memory. He gets the ball rolling to get your machine to boot up. Okay, that's our BIOS. Well, Macintosh computers use something called an EFI BIOS. So it's not necessarily a new technology, or something Apple has used for a while. Their operating system, specifically when they wrote the Mac OS, it looks for that EFI BIOS. And if it doesn't see it, it won't launch. Right? It won't even install on the machine, actually. Where Windows, because they wrote that operating system to run on a zillion different computers, where at some point in time, Asus or something might come out with a motherboard that uses an EFI-based BIOS or something, well, they had to write it to not necessarily look for that. So Windows will go on any machine. Mac will only go on their machines, let's say in theory. Okay, so that's one problem, is just that the installer for the Mac OS specifically looks for a Mac certified EFI BIOS, just a little signature that says, yes, I'm a Mac, you can install yourself on me, and then it will allow the install to happen. So that's one problem. Right? Now, there are workarounds for that. So a little bit ago, I mentioned a project called Hackintosh. Okay, so if you're desperate and you have a PC and you want to run the Mac OS on it, there is a project called Hackintosh which allows you to has your computer fake an EFI BIOS. Okay, and the Mac OS will go on there. But even after you get the OS installed, now you still have problems. Why do you think you still have problems even after you somehow magically get the Mac OS installed on your Dell laptop? Huh? Driver problems. So when Windows writes their operating system, they try to they load a whole bunch of software drivers on there to support a zillion different devices, right? And then if you are somebody who comes out with hardware, the very least you make sure your hardware has software drivers for Windows, because a zillion people are running Windows. Well, when Apple writes their operating systems, which drivers do they support? Well, they support the drivers for the devices that Apple has in their machines, right? And even at that level, Apple has used proprietary devices. So for example, if you went out, so for those of you who are gamers, let's say, even though most of our Macs aren't necessarily, the video card can't be upgraded, but if you have a Mac Pro, you can. So if you go out to Best Buy and you buy the latest, greatest, coolest video card from NVIDIA or ATI, whoever released it 15 minutes ago. All right, so you just dropped $1,500, brand new graphics card. It uses the same kind of port on a Windows machine as it would on a Mac. They both have the same physical plug to plug the thing in. You bring the thing home, works great in a Windows machine. You try to put it in the Mac Pro, it'll look like just a normal VGA output. Won't be able to talk to it right. $1,500 for a grayscale color running at 640 by 480 resolution. Not very good. Okay, well, why is that? Well, when Apple has these companies make hardware for their devices, they have them specifically put in an identifier that this was made for Mac. So Apple's hardware looks specifically for those. So bottom line is Apple's kind of just a jerk.
Why did they do that?
So you have to use their stuff, you have to buy their stuff, and if you go to
I feel like they just deter a lot of people.
clearly, let's look around the room here. How many people have Macs in the room? Several. I mean, on paper, you're right. It seems like it should deter a lot of people, but it's actually, we talked a little bit about this last time, when Apple went away from that, the company almost failed. It's almost like the proprietary nature of Apple is kind of what makes Apple work. And part of it is that end user experience. When Apple is creating these drivers, when they're making their operating systems, and this is something Apple has come under fire with in the past as well, it's if you're building a gaming computer as an individual, so you're getting, buying your motherboard from place X, buying your RAM from place Y, and so on and so forth, and putting together a whole computer. That's going to be your highest performance, whatever, for games. And then, you look at your Mac, and you look at these specific specs on the Mac. Well, they don't necessarily use what you would judge as the highest performance RAM, or the highest performance hard drive, or the highest performance XYZ. But what Apple does, at least claims they do, and they put a lot of effort into this, is all their stuff balances together kind of right. They don't necessarily pick the best stuff as an individual, but they pick stuff that works well together. So part of the benefit of maybe a Mac is that the end user experience with the same level of hardware, let's say, tends to be more stable than the end user experience for random collection of hardware, even if those look like they should be higher performance. So part of it is that. So Apple controls the entire user experience on their devices, whether it's an iPhone or a Mac laptop or an iMac, whatever it is. They write the operating system. They don't make all the hardware. They make a lot of the hardware now, but at the very least, they control the hardware makers. So if you want to have hardware that's made for the Mac, you have to play by Apple's game. So let's just say at some level, they make the hardware. They do make a lot of their own hardware as well. And then they make a lot of the software. And they control which hardware is even compatible with it by only Apple writes all the drivers. So when a graphics card comes out for Apple, you have to, they've worked with Apple specifically for Apple to write a driver because they keep their operating system proprietary. So what a software driver is, it's the piece of software that sits between, for example, that graphics card and the Macintosh operating system. So rather than Apple revealing secrets about its operating system, it says, yeah, you just tell me how your graphics card works. We'll write that software because we know about our operating system. Okay, so Apple's proprietary to the core. And it's something that when we hear about it as consumers, it kind of leaves a bad taste. Like, why would anybody do that? That's just not cool, right? But it sort of has worked for them historically. I can't necessarily even explain it. Same thing's true on iPhone. I mean, the people who are Android fans, typically, if we're just kind of grouping them into a category, are people who either don't like Apple and they're kind of their way of doing things, or kind of appreciate the open nature of Android. You can do what you want to do as a user of an Android device. You're not locked into the Apple way. Those are probably related statements, but I mean, that's usually, if you talk to an Android person, they're not necessarily saying that, Android's user experience is better, Android's interface is better. They're not talking about stuff like that. They're not talking about the battery life. They're not talking about all these other things. They're talking about, I don't have to play by Apple's rules. I get to do what I want to do with my device, which seems like a perfectly reasonable reason to use an Android device, right? Well, then you have the flip side. When people say they use Apple devices, they don't necessarily argue that, I guess they don't argue about much. They typically say something along the lines of, it just works, right? Have you heard an Apple person say that before? And things work great as long as you have an entire Apple ecosystem. So if everything you own is Apple, well, all your stuff just kind of talks to it, right? It's great. Okay, but you start throwing a couple of non-Apple devices in there, well, all of a sudden it loses some of its shine, is I guess the punchline. So at the end of the day, I guess we really benefit as consumers because we get this experience where, hey, if you want to choose maybe the little bit less completely integrated user experience, which Android would basically be that, right? Because they're not trying to be everything to everyone. They're saying, hey, you're a user, you get to choose how you're going to use your device. Things that are made specifically for Android are going to integrate really well. So for instance, if you have an Android device and you use a lot of Google services, Google Docs, things like that, it's going to work pretty seamlessly. You start using other people's stuff, well, it might not work as well. It's nature of the beast. Or so you can be in that side of things where you want to have that freedom at the cost of sometimes convenience, or you can be in the other side of the coin and say, well, I'll pay Apple's premium. My stuff just kind of works. Every year, for some reason, I somehow mentally get forced back into the store to give them more money, and we almost don't notice. The second a new iPhone comes out, I'm buying the new one because my old one, this is the 6S Plus. Last year I had the 6 Plus. Now I use it as a soap dish. Because, why would anybody carry a 6 Plus if the 6S Plus is out? It's not even a functional machine anymore, right? That's almost like the mentality Apple has put into people. We just have to keep giving them more and more money. So I don't think there's a great logic to it. It's just kind of what's worked for the company historically.
Even if they want to keep that proprietary nature, like you said, you have 16 gig RAM and your friend has 8. Why don't they still sell the Apple One, but just make it so you can do it, so you don't have to go out and buy a new one?
Oh, you mean to upgrade the RAM?
Yeah.
Well, when they did part of it was because the Apple has this this fascination with making their stuff thinner and lighter. So by making stuff thinner and lighter, what you have to start doing is you have to remove the number of parts that are replaceable. So one of the things Apple has done to make this lighter and thinner but have longer battery life is they've taken out the components that allow you to swap in and out batteries and instead replace that with a little bit larger battery. Well, so now you can't swap out a battery. Same thing's true with the RAM. In order to, before, a RAM chip is not very large, but the whole mechanism for holding 3 or 4 RAM chips takes up a lot more space than those 3 or 4 RAM chips takes, probably twice the space. So if you take out the ability to swap out RAM, and you said instead just put it right onto the motherboard, at this point you're not even now stuck with having the physical size of the RAM chip. You just have to find some place to put all the individual pieces of that RAM chip somewhere on the motherboard. So more space they make up for. So by going thinner and thinner and thinner and lighter and all this stuff, you lose your the features. And at some point, do we necessarily want thinner or lighter? I would say so with what did they have with the 6S? I think they used a different metal this time. They had the Apple's bend gate, where people were taking their phones out of their pocket and they had a little curve to it because it didn't really have the structural integrity, I guess. I never had that experience, but I think other people certainly did. But if you take an iPhone 6 Plus or 6S Plus, I personally think, and maybe it's just because I have big hands or fat fingers or whatever, but I think it's too thin. I want there to be a little more bulk. So I would wear a case use a case anyways, just because I drop my phone and stuff all the time. But I think it's too thin as the device itself. I'd rather it be a little bulkier, just so it feels like I have something and it's not going to just get caught in the wind and now it's gone, right? But Apple seems to have this move towards thinner, 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 right? Same thing's true with the MacBook Airs. So, this is a MacBook Pro, no longer has a DVD player. And this is since 2012, I think, is this one. Let's look here real quick. Yeah, mid-2012. So this is a 3 or 4 year, 3.5-year-old computer. Well, that's a while ago. So in that amount of time, I no longer have a DVD drive. I still have 16 gigs of RAM, so that's a pretty good computer, even by today's standards. But the issue is that, this computer being a 15-inch computer is still pretty portable. It's not that heavy. do you really need a MacBook Air? Is it really worth giving up the performance, the RAM, all the screen size to save yourself £1.50 or something like that? Yeah, but and also what's nice about the Airs though is they do have multi-purpose, because you know how the Airs kind of go down to a wedge. I mean, you can use it to chop vegetables. You have all sorts of like benefits with that. And to be honest, I used to have a 11.6-inch MacBook Air, so the smallest one. I could probably argue it was maybe the best machine I've had. I mean, because that thing is an inch longer than an iPad, so it really is a tablet, but you can do everything you can do on a laptop. So I can see how maybe that machine makes sense for people who travel a lot. But the 13-inch MacBook Air doesn't make any sense to me. Why get a 13-inch MacBook Air when you can get a 13-inch MacBook Pro for, let's say, about the same amount of money and twice the performance? And what it weighs 8 ounces more or something like that. I mean, fine, you can't chop carrots. Well, you could smash carrots probably, but you can't chop them. There's no moving parts in these things anymore because they're all solid-state drives now. So you probably smash carrots and not really damage your machine. But the Air has a nice edge. Just saying. So if you're looking for that dual purpose, then the Air makes sense. But you can do that with the 11.6-inch. But punchline is Apple's move seems to be always wanted to focus on aesthetics and thinness, and really from their business model perspective, why let the user upgrade? Why give them the opportunity? Because I mean, so my iMac, I can put RAM in there, because they're less about trying to put make that even thinner, I guess. But I can put my own RAM in there. So when I upgraded the RAM in my iMac, I didn't buy Apple RAM. Went to Newegg and got whatever was the right kind of RAM that was the cheapest price. Why pay a premium? You just need more RAM. I'm not going to notice as an end user, I didn't need the gold-plated heatsink RAM that these gamers get because it has, some fraction of a nanosecond faster fire time or something. I'm not going to notice that when I'm just writing software. Maybe if I was, Call of Duty or a Battlefield fanatic, and I might notice those things, but in those games I just get shot right away, so it doesn't really matter. But the idea is that from Apple's perspective, if they don't let you upgrade their machines, that just means you're going to walk back through their door in a year and say, "Oh, I need more memory." Well, unfortunately, that's not an upgradable machine, but we do have a new program where you can give us your laptop and we'll give you a credit towards giving us more money, and then we'll sell you a brand new laptop. Great. Just saw, I think I liked on Facebook yesterday, a thing that Apple's going to start taking in as a trade-in, just smashed up iPhones. I mean, if you bring, it's kind of like the car dealerships where it's if you could drag it in, they'll give you $1,000 for it or something like that. They just showed like this iPhone that was like just shattered out. And Apple's like, "Oh yeah, we'll take that." Just from their perspective, they're just, what does the screen cost them? Probably a dime or something. It might even be less than that, to be honest. So you have perfectly working parts. From the user's perspective, this is an unusable phone. From Apple's perspective, most of what you have in there is worth $60 or $70 to us. So we'll give you $30 off your next phone. Well, you thought you were going to get nothing. And now you're going to give us $600. Well, $570. And we're already marking it up 50%. So we didn't even need $570 out of you to make it worth it. But we'll take it. So I guess that's the Apple model. And that's okay. It works. Right? And from a consumer's perspective, we can choose to give them their money. I mean, if I were buying a new computer today, it would always be a Mac. Not because I'm necessarily a fan of Apple as a company, but I'm used to using the devices. I like having both OSs on one machine. I can dual boot. I don't want to play that game of having to mess around with Hackintosh. And the reason why Hackintosh doesn't work, we were kind of getting at before, is this idea that your PC, your Dell laptop, or your home-built computer is likely using parts that Apple has never used on their devices before. So it doesn't have drivers. So now you got to look for all these hacks. How do I get my Hackintosh version of Mac OS sort of kind of acting right? I'd rather it just work, and that means paying a premium, and so be it. Because this is I make my living wielding a computer. That's what I do. So it's worth the extra premium. Yeah.
But probably when you run like Windows on Macintosh on a MacBook, is the window when you run Windows, the heat coming is a lot.
That it gets hot.
Yeah, it's gonna wet out your laptop.
I guess I haven't noticed, but that's possibly a true statement. I know some interesting things because Apple makes the drivers for the Windows side as well to work with their hard drive, their hardware. So I think I don't know what they've been the last couple of years. I maybe assume they've done as well, but I think 3 or 4 years ago, the 15-inch MacBook Pro, I think this machine, was for Consumer Reports the best Windows laptop. It had the highest performance rating of all the Windows laptops, even against Dell and all those. And part of that's just Apple made their drivers work really, really, really well with their hardware, running somebody else's operating system. I'm not necessarily saying that, if you're only going to run Windows, you should get a Mac. In fact, that would be somewhat ridiculous, I guess I would say. Going to be a Windows user, probably get a nice Windows machine and then take the extra money you saved to make a few car payments or something like that. But I guess my experience has been that Windows running on a Mac is a far, far, far superior experience than Mac running on a PC, which you might not even get to work. Now, having said that, one of our grad students, who is also part of a startup company that I mentor with, he's in our grad program. His name is Yiming Liao. We call him Blade. It's easier to say that. But there's actually a funny story behind that too. But in any case, he has a PC laptop that he runs Mac on. And he primarily does Apple development. Just doesn't want to spend the money on a new computer. He seems to work fine. So it's punchline is it's possible. So if you want to do Mac stuff and don't want to have to buy a Mac, maybe it's a decent hobbyist type thing to kind of get it working. Okay. So that whole conversation, the punchline is why doesn't the Mac OS run on a PC? It's because Apple doesn't want it to. that's the punchline. Why does Windows run on a Mac? Well, because Microsoft has to write their software to run on a zillion different computers because they don't make hardware. It's like asking why does Windows run on a Dell, or why does Windows run on a Hewlett Packard? They didn't make that hardware. They have to make it available for all these different platforms. And from Apple or from Microsoft's perspective, the more people that are running Windows, the better. That's licensing, right? Unfortunately, a pretty high percentage of folks are who have Windows are running illegitimate versions of Windows, right? It's pretty highly pirated software, and really Microsoft doesn't even complain anymore. They just give you a little thing on the bottom right that says this copy of Windows is not genuine. I was helping down in the cafeteria yesterday. Some of the employees there, they have their own Sodexo terminal in the back where they can check their time cards and stuff like that. And they needed to have the PDF viewer updated. So I went back and looked at it. They're running a bootleg version of Windows on, on that. So I don't know, what are you going to do? And I think even with Windows 10, didn't Microsoft, I think Microsoft will allow you to just pay the upgrade fee and upgrade even a pirated version of Windows to Windows 10 for whatever their upgrade fee is, instead of requiring you to buy a legitimate copy. From the school, or you stole it?
Well, I had Windows 8 unofficially.
Yeah.
And then when it notified me to pop up to Windows 10, it popped me to a legal version for free.
Oh, nice. Yes, that's perfect.
Windows 7 and Windows 10. Windows 7, Windows 8 to Windows 10.
Okay, so the best way to get Windows 10 on your machine is to. So is that the thing? Is the upgrade free, but to buy the whole operating system costs money?
Yeah.
With Windows 10? Okay, so the best way to get Windows 10 on your machine, and this is your advice. I'm not necessarily promoting this. It is your advice. Would be steal Windows, an older version, kind of whatever's convenient, right? And then freely upgrade to Windows 10. Now you're good to go. Oh, fair enough. By the way, we do have an MSDN site license here on campus, specifically through computer science, so you can actually get Windows 10 for free, the full version, from us. Yeah, you didn't even need to steal that software, but yeah, it probably made you feel better about yourself.
I stole it before I got here.
So, okay, so you're implying that you would not steal it now, that you've changed, you've been embedded in this Christian environment.
So I don't need to steal it.
But the problem is, when you have a Windows 7 all the way on your laptop, you upgrade to Windows 10, it's going to be personal, not going to be
Okay, so you get like the lower end version of Windows,
Yeah.
Windows 10. Fair enough. We can get you whatever version you want, free from the department here. Just talk to Valerie Locklear. She's our IT dealy, flippy, majiggy. She does everything. Anything that works here, she did. All the stuff that's broken, we did. That's that's kind of the punchline. All right, so last time we started, I created the slide as a reminder. So what actually happened to Apple? So Apple goes and acquires Next Computers, installs Steve Jobs as their interim CEO. The company makes a strong comeback with all the iPod and all those products. And most people are lulled into this idea that Apple was saved as a company. The reality is what we see today is actually Next Computers with an Apple logo on it. And we see it at the operating system level. If I go back into here, we'll just look at some software development stuff for the Mac OS. So here's Apple's developer page for Mac Developer Library. Notice they have a whole bunch of stuff in here that start with the phrase, the two letters NS, NS object, NS string, NS mutable string, NS simple string. They have hundreds of NS things. NS stands for next step. So at the core of your Macintosh computer today, you're effectively running the next user experience, even the software. Keep in mind, this is today, years and years and years after Apple acquired Next. It's still there today. So it's kind of a big deal when you look at it from that perspective. That most people are lulled into this idea that Apple today is the Apple from yesteryear that just kind of righted the ship. Maybe, Steve Jobs came back, he fixed things. You might have that perception or something, but he did fix things by replacing the stuff that wasn't working at Apple when he effectively rebranded Next, because Apple was failing as a company because they had moved into this world of Apple-compatible hardware. Back in that day, Apple's stuff was all running on PowerPC processors, so they weren't running Intel. So there was a hardware disconnect between Windows and PCs and Macintosh computers. PCs were running Intel-based processors. Macintosh computers were running PowerPC-based processors, which were made by IBM. And when the second or third version of OS X came out, that's when Apple made the transition. They decided we're going to support Intel. So now all of our Macintosh computers are all Intel-based computers, so they have the same hardware in them as your PC counterparts. But whatever. So what happened to Apple? It died. Next Computers replaced it, and they kept the Apple logo. And by moving to Intel, what they effectively did is they were able to cut off that let's call it bad decision from the past of allowing third-party places to make Macintosh or make Apple clones. Because now clones were all PowerPC based stuff, and now Apple could kind of start from scratch and build their machines around the Intel platform. Okay, so this is the Objective-C 2.0, came out after acquired Next Computers. So let's now talk about, I'm going to jump way back here to the beginning, and actually I want to see, do I have it installed in here yet? I'll go ahead and install it. We're going to start talking about some programming stuff now. And just as a starting point, I'm actually going to, I'll take you to the website for this and tell you a little bit about the tool we're going to use in here. So we're going to use a tool that actually came out of a university called Carnegie Mellon. It's in Pittsburgh. How many of you have heard of Carnegie Mellon before? Just a couple of you. It's actually, depending on the week, one of the top 2 computer science schools in the world. So it's them and MIT. So Carnegie Mellon is everybody's heard of MIT. Carnegie Mellon's like the one nobody talks about, but it's where the Google cars were invented. So cars have been driving themselves around Carnegie Mellon campus for years. Kind of a cool place. But in any case, the concept here for beginning programming, and this is where Alice kind of was born out of. They're in version 3 now, so it's actually been out for a while. And the reason I decided to look at this is version 3 has made it far more complex. So we're able to do some more complex things with that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you know, the historical problem with computer programming, as I've pointed out already to some extent, is that programming is hard. I've kind of mentioned that it's you think of it like a sport. So you can academically understand some of these things, but to actually go and apply it becomes a difficult thing. And when you look at your average university curriculum for computer programming, you run into this problem where, you know, so let's just call it programming 1, programming 2, programming 3. Okay, we'll just keep it simple like that. When programming 1, which would be like this class, when that is taught using a traditional language, when we're focusing on the syntax and the problem solving, you lose, I think it's something like 70% of your at-risk students going into the second class. Okay? So the punchline is that, now, there may be some of you in this audience that programming is just not going to be your thing. That's possible. Okay? It's not necessarily for everyone. But the issue is that, and then on the other extreme, there's going to be some of you in here that are going to take to it very quickly. You know, just your mind already works that way, you know, things like that. So those folks we wouldn't have called the at-risk folks. So if we had taught this programming 1 class in a traditional manner, you would have come through just fine, those folks. Now it's the big group in the middle, right? The folks that have it in them to be good programmers. But because we talked about the problem with human beings, that we're so good at solving problems that we have trouble articulating how we solve them, getting over that hump and focusing on that side of the problem, the side of the problem where we're having to train our brains how to think, how to talk to a computer, rather than train our brains how to think and talk to a computer and learn this creepy syntax, all right? At the same time, it's those people, that group, so that's going to be a majority of us in here that are going to find programming difficult. And you know, it's hard enough for us to try to slow down our thinking and tell a computer what to do step by step. All right, so now having said that, where Alice comes in, the idea behind this is, and it was part of a research project at Carnegie Mellon, so this was part of something they built and they actually looked at results, is they were able to reduce the number of students that they lost between programming 1 and programming 2 by something like 80%. Somewhere in here they show their numbers, so you can check the numbers. I'm not horribly misrepresenting it at the very least. So something by like 80%, where people would leave programming 1 and then go on and be successful in programming 2. As opposed to before, people would either leave programming 1 and change majors, or leave programming 1, go into programming 2 and fail out of it. Because somewhere in there they were never given that opportunity to retrain their mind, because they were trying to learn too much at once. So what we're going to do here with Alice is it effectively allows us to create a 3D world. So we're going to be making kind of video gamey type things. We start off with this idea of we're almost telling a story in code. But instead of writing a whole lot of syntax where you can make typos and things like that, what Alice lets us do is it allows us to go ahead and, for instance, you can start one of the tutorials. That's actually the one I'll probably put up. I'm going to give you a homework assignment to do over the weekend to get this installed and things like that, is a Leapfrog program. So what they have you do is they have you put, I think there's like a baby Yeti 3D guy on the screen, a little cute little monster looking thing. And then they have the big bad wolf, I think he's on the screen. And what the tutorial has you do is you have the big bad wolf is facing the baby Yeti, and the baby Yeti's facing away, and the big bad wolf jumps over him, then he jumps over him, so they play Leapfrog. All right, is what they're doing. Well, so you're creating this environment that would, if you were to write this by hand with a lot of syntax, would be fairly difficult to write. But you're able to do it with just a few commands, and all of the coding aspects of it is just drag and drop. All right, so the tutorial I'll put up, whether I do that one or another one, is going to be just introducing you to the tool. And then what we'll do is we'll start looking at the tool in more detail on Monday and talk about computer programming concepts in the context of Alice. So we'll introduce variables, we'll introduce conditionals, we'll introduce loops in general, and then talk about the Alice version of that. I might also show you Java, the Java equivalent, but at the end of the day, we'll be looking at Alice. Sound good? So look for the assignment to be up sometime this afternoon. I just need to pick the right tutorial, and then I'll see everybody on Monday.